Hello and welcome back to another video on the channel by me, TheWiseJames. So we're going to watch this video, what it was like to be a mental health patient in the 1900s. Except I have been a mental health patient inside mental health wards. So I have personal experience with this. So I'm not looking at it from a doctor's point of view or a normal person's point of view. I'll be looking at it from a previous crazy person's point of view. Okay? Alright, let's go.
1800s, psychiatric hospitals were known as lunatic asylums or insane asylums, and officials there would lock patients up against their will, despite having few ideas about how to properly treat their problems. In 1900, patients at psychiatric hospitals in the United States faced inhumane treatment that
Still do today.
would be regarded as nothing short of torture.
Still do today.
So, today, we're going to take a look at what it was like to be a patient in a U.S. mental hospital in the year 1900.
I will be correcting quite a few things, I bet.
Subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other medical-related topics you would like to hear about. Okay, hang on. This one is gonna get crazy.
Patients are still
In the early days of
hospitalized
psychiatric
involuntarily.
hospitals, not everyone chose to enter one of their own free will. In fact, up until the 1960s, the majority of patients in the U.S. mental health facilities were admitted involuntarily.
Okay, right, I'm stopping right there. People are still carted off to mental health hospitals and we'll call them asylums all the time in the UK. Like, they've just changed the law so the police can't attend unless it's a life or death situation. That wasn't the case during my experiences. The government or the police they came out fairly mistreated me from my perspective. But they were just doing their job, you know. We're not getting to it. So it's still involuntarily. People get dragged off to these places. It's not a historical thing. It's still present today. And all over the world, people in the UK and the USA obviously treat better than most places.
Contrast, about 71% of people in psychiatric institutions today are there voluntarily.
There are quite a few voluntarily people there, yes.
Had a lot to do with the laws that allowed families to commit their relatives with little to no.
There are people who try and use the system to get free food, free accommodation. They're not even mentally unwell. They pretend to be mentally unwell to be in that situation rather than face the real world. There are people who do that.
Supporting evidence. In 1860, for example, based on an Illinois law, Elizabeth Packard landed in an asylum for 3 years for no reason other than that she practiced a different religion from her husband. Parents also routinely committed their children to mental institutions for questionable reasons. In 1883, Henry Fraser was sent to an asylum in New Orleans because his mother called him uncontrollable, saying that he played with himself to complete exhaustion. Exacerbating the problem were perverse financial incentives for the hospitals themselves. That is, families could literally just purchase confinement for relatives they didn't want to deal with. I could see that temptation. And patients might stay in psychiatric institutions for extended periods. By 1904, only 27.8% of asylum patients in the U.S. had been institutionalized for a year or less. The vast majority were long-term cases.
They still do. A lot of places still people like prisoners.
Some people with mental...
It sounds ridiculous in 2024, but patients are still treated like prisoners in quite a lot of situations in hospitals. So you want to go out and see your family when you're in a hospital ward in the UK, you obviously need to be let out of the ward by a nurse or a doctor. They could refuse to let you out if you don't take medication that you don't want to take because it's making you unwell, and they're refusing to put you on other medications because this one is what they want to use. But if it makes you more unwell than your condition, it doesn't matter to them. They're doctors. They have control of your freedom and your life, and they will stop you from seeing your children if you don't do what they say. They will also not give you your freedom back to rejoin society if you do not do as they say. Sometimes, not all the time. There are some good doctors, but some of them, no.
Mental health issues tried to hide their condition to avoid being sent to an asylum, and it's hard to blame them. In 1887, journalist Nellie Bly agreed to go undercover in a mental asylum to record the conditions inside. She reported horrific treatment from doctors, including hair pulling and solitary confinement. Bly also decried the way patients were treated like prisoners. She wrote of how when she couldn't sleep, she would lay in bed imagining how horrible it would be if a fire broke out in the institution. Bly had noticed that every door in the building was locked separately, and the windows were all heavily barred, meaning that escape was close to impossible. A doctor had told her that in one building alone there were some 300 women locked 10 to a room, and it was impossible to get out unless the doors were manually unlocked. By the early 20th century, many mental hospitals routinely tested patients for syphilis. We now know syphilis would remain incurable until the advent of antibiotics. But in 1900, at the Oregon State Hospital, doctors used what was called malarial treatment for people newly infected with the disease. Doctors who used the treatment, first advocated by Dr. Julius Wagner Jauregg, intentionally injected malaria germs into a patient's bloodstream based on the theory that malarial fever could kill syphilis.
Okay. Just 1 second. Let's get back. You see this man injecting in their butt cheek. That if you refuse to take medication in the UK orally, like you refuse to take tablets, they can do that to you. Obviously, if you refuse it, they can get staff to restrain you and they will jab it in your arm. But you can be put on a what's it called? A treatment order, basically, where if you don't take it, you'll remain in hospital. You know, you won't be allowed out of hospital unless you take it, and they will force you to take it. And if you don't take it when you're out of hospital, they would then take your freedom away. You'd be dragged back to your little cage. Yeah, that's what they do. But can you imagine how dangerous it is that the fact that they let trainee nurses do this stuff in the UK? Just to point that out, there are people in mental health hospitals who aren't stupid and aren't that mentally unwell, and the dangers are quite often sometimes overlooked. Like, they just are.
Into a patient's bloodstream based on the theory that malarial fever could kill syphilis. Wagner Jauregg's research showed that approximately half of these patients saw a reduction in syphilis symptoms after the malaria infection, which sounds pretty promising. However, the same research showed that at least 15% died from the treatment, which is less promising, although it didn't stop them from using it.
Yeah, even if there's no cure, just keep on
The early
poisoning them.
mental illness were,
It's a lot of treatment, that is.
Absolutely brutal. In the early 19th century, asylums in England used a wheel to spin patients at high speed. Other treatments, still used at the end of the 19th century, included harnessing patients and swinging them, or branding a patient with hot irons in an attempt to bring them to their senses. You're probably thinking that eventual improvements in medical technology meant better treatment, but that was far from the case. It usually just meant new forms of torture. By the 1930s, doctors began to experiment with new, troubling methods of treating mental illness, which included lobotomies and electroshock therapy. Patients soon learned the only way to get out of the insane asylum was to fake it. You do just what the doctor says if you want to get out of here, one patient said. Of course, while faking it might have gotten you out, it didn't cure you. The same patient we just quoted later died by their own hand. Mental hospitals around 1900 didn't just treat adults, they also admitted children. Between 1854 and 1900, the Worcester County Asylum screened hundreds of children who were 16 or younger to determine whether they needed treatment. The asylum admitted nearly 200 children, reporting their violent tendencies and risk of suicide. One study found a high death rate among the children, who rarely saw their families after being admitted. This isn't too surprising, given that doctors treated the children in the same way as their adult patients, making no allowances for their young age. Inside the mental hospital, patients slept in single rooms or dormitories. Nellie Bly described women sleeping 10 to a room, with locked doors and bars on the windows. And at the Oregon State Hospital, we know that sleeping rooms were 7.
I'd like to point out that nothing much has changed. Instead of it being a dilapidated, a run-down, hostel. These days, it just looks more like a hospital. That's all. Obviously, in places where it's privatized and they make money for it, they make it look as good as possible. But when it's publicly funded, like in the UK, Honestly, sometimes people don't get fed. There's not enough food. So if they're at the back of the queue or they're too unwell, they miss their tea. It's not like the nurses do sometimes check on some places, but all places, I've seen plenty of people miss meals because there wasn't enough food. The paint's peeling off the walls. People have no idea. No idea.
And by 14 feet. The Morning Oregonian reported in 1883 that the hospital contained modern technology, including dumbwaiters that opened and closed as they traveled, to prevent patients from escaping. Ironically, late 19th century reforms had proposed treating mental illness with rest, beautiful buildings, and manicured grounds, resulting in majestic architecture on the outside of mental hospitals. It was all so nice, the facilities sometimes even attracted asylum tourists. However, despite the tranquil outsides, the conditions inside the hospital still reflected the idea that patients should be treated as prisoners.
We still do that in 2024. Treat them as prisoners.
In 1900, the lousy treatment at psychiatric hospitals wasn't solely reserved for long-term residents. In fact, newly admitted patients were often immediately subjected to dehumanizing tests. At the Oregon State Hospital, for example, patients had to empty their pockets and strip for a bath. After a medical examination, patients underwent blood and syphilis tests. Finally, they might be shown to a room with bars on the windows and left alone. Women's institutions sometimes used different procedures. According to Nellie Bly, her examination to fully determine if she was mentally ill included a physical assessment, where a doctor accused her of taking drugs. You'd think a top priority for a psychiatric facility would be to make sure everyone could easily tell the difference between doctors and patients. But that wasn't always the case. At the Oregon State Hospital, at least, the standard white outfits could actually be confusing. According to one patient, neither patients nor staff wore uniforms. The first person this patient saw was a man in a white apron. He thought that person was an attendant, and he asked him a question. But later he learned that that man in the apron was also a patient, and the two were in the same ward. Awkward. During his involuntary commitment, the patient found himself perpetually confused, eventually concluding, usually the attendants are a little better dressed than the patients. At St. Elizabeth's, also known as the Government Hospital for the Insane, Dr. Harry Hummer promoted eggs as an important part of the diet for sick patients, recording that 125 patients went through 17 dozen eggs every day. Patients with epilepsy, meanwhile, received a special diet. According to Hummer, these patients were not allowed to have anything that doctors thought would upset them, which included foods like corned beef or cabbage, and so-called heavy indigestible foods. Nellie Bly described a meal consisting of tea, a single piece of bread, rancid butter, and 5 prunes. After a 10-day undercover visit in Bellevue Hospital, Bly reported, "The eating was one of the most horrible things." However, conditions could vary, and patients at another asylum reported the dining room felt more like a restaurant or hotel dining room. Patients sat together while other patients served them. Some institutions also grew their own food on the grounds, with patients working in the field to theoretically improve their mental health, which also saved money for the institution.
I'm just finding this difficult because it's personal to me, that's all. I'm trying to react, but
Hospitals often housed multiple patients in barracks-like conditions that were significantly less than pleasant. In the nights before patient Taylor Benjamin, aka John the Baptist, died at the New Orleans City Insane Asylum in 1893, he reportedly slept very little, if any, at night, and was constantly screaming. One patient at the Oregon State Hospital also reported a complete lack of privacy. When he was resting in his room on his first day, another patient wandered in to tuck in the sheets. He was followed by 2 other patients who simply stared at the new arrival without talking. Room service. Bellevue Hospital in New York featured similar conditions. Nellie Bly reported about a crying woman who begged for death nearly the entire night. Another woman repeatedly...
I used to have a man walking past my room constantly. Yeah, nice man, actually. Quite nice. And he was always worried, I'm going to die. He was always talking to himself and shouting, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And one day I was just really tired. I was trying to get some sleep and it was really pissing me off. It'd been weeks of it. And I just said, we're all going to fucking die. Get over it. He was fine a few weeks later and got discharged. Yeah. No credit to me, of course.
Yelled, murder. That's a tough environment to work on your mental health. Reformers in the 19th century encouraged states to build insane asylums. The effort was successful, and by the 1870s, most states had built at least one asylum, using tax dollars to treat those labeled insane. The Oregon State Hospital opened in 1883, and by 1936, the state had expanded the facilities to 2 additional buildings. At the time, the institution treated 2,400 patients. Reformers also argued that mental illnesses could be treated by rest and recuperation, which drove the creation of peaceful, manicured estates to treat patients. These often included gardens and lawns where patients could walk, and architecturally beautiful structures. Asylum tourism became a popular pursuit by the late 19th century. Guidebooks even recommended visits to asylums, including the Bloomingdale Asylum for the Insane.
Like a fucking zoo. Come see the fucking animals, huh? Yeah. And that's what I imagine the people made money from taking tours of asylums.
Doctors believed many different conditions could cause insanity, and sometimes committing patients to insane asylums was their only option. Records from the New Orleans...
Most insanity is caused by trauma or traumatic events, or witnessing trauma and traumatic events, things that are difficult to process. Grief, injury, loss, many things, but generally trauma causes insanity.
So the insane asylum in the late 1800s, for example, included notes from doctors that listed some of the reasons they might commit a patient. A man named Frank Canva was committed because malarial fevers had left him deranged. One William Byrne was institutionalized after he fell from a horse and landed on his head, which doctors said caused a softening of the brain. Henry Schreiber's diagnosis was congenital idiocy, and doctors wrote he had been an idiot from birth. And in the case of Jane D. Patterson,
learning difficulties,
who apparently drank too much whiskey, doctors concluded the cause of her insanity is chronic alcoholism. Good times. So
can't face their trauma, drink because of it.
Mental health changed over the years. Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos.
How much has mental health changed over the years? Well, 100 years ago, I would have been one of those people, you see. I would have been one of these people. They probably would have tried to either give me an exorcism to get rid of the voices for schizophrenia, or they would have given me electrotherapy, which means they would have put a hole in the middle of my head and then electrocuted my brain, try to make me better, which wouldn't have worked. Being a schizophrenic my whole life wouldn't have worked. And if that didn't work, then they would have lobotomized me. They would have cut my brain in two while holding me down and tied to a chair, nothing you can do, to try and make you better, when that's like removing someone's heart to fix the blood pressure. It's not going to work. Don't be stupid. Absolutely ridiculous. And people are still held against their will. They're still basically attacked by their country's government's authority, police or law enforcement, whatever, who will then cart them off to some hospital or mental health ward or worse. Generally, they separate the violent patients from non-violent patients. So if you were to become mentally ill and you had been violent your entire life, you're probably going to be thrown in with the most violent, insane people. Whereas if you've never been violent, you've always been a good person, you won't be thrown in with the violent people, usually. But yeah, that was interesting. It hasn't really changed much over 100 years. Like, people with mental health problems and insane people are still treated like they're worthless human beings who are a burden on society, rather than vulnerable adults who have usually been mistreated, and therefore their brains can't work properly from the mistreatment. Generally, that's what happens. Although it can be from head injuries and other things. Of course, there are variables, but most of the time, people's mental health problems are caused by trauma, not being able to process and deal with the stuff that's happened to them in their life. And these things are only getting more prevalent in 2024 simply because people aren't talking anymore, looking another human in the eye, explaining what's going on in their life about their heart and their mind, their problems. It's all on a phone with pixels which have no emotion. The person perceives it in their own brain and in their own words and their own voice. They don't hear you say it. That's how humans were supposed to communicate. So mental health problems are only going to get worse until humans essentially learn to communicate better, rather than relying on technology to communicate basically. I know it sounds silly because we can communicate better with technology, but I mean, verbal communication is becoming more uncommon, more uneasy. People are less adept at it. But yeah. So that's mental health problems in the 1900s, watched by a person with mental health problems. Have a good one. Bye.